When a veteran's truck breaks down near an abandoned farm, he knocks on a door expecting silence. But what he finds instead is a long-lost friend and a life-changing proposal. What if one day, a simple breakdown on the road led you back to your purpose? The rain had been falling hard for over an hour. Thick sheets of water crashed against the windshield of Thomas's rig, blurring the distant outlines of trees and fence posts. The wipers squealed back and forth, fighting a losing battle. The old Freightliner groaned as he downshifted, but it was no use. The engine coughed, rattled, then died completely. He let out a slow breath and turned the key again. Nothing. A dim red light blinked on the dashboard. Battery low. Fuel gauge fine. Transmission shot, maybe. Whatever it was, he wasn't getting back on the road tonight. "Damn it," he muttered, rubbing his temples beneath his soaked cap. Thomas, 62, with a graying beard and calloused hands, stepped out of the cab and into the storm. His boots sank slightly into the mud as he adjusted his jacket collar. He reached for his phone, dead. No signal, even if it weren't. For a long moment, he just stood there, lit only by the truck's emergency blinkers, rain dripping from his brow. He was too old for this kind of mess, too tired. The road had a way of wearing a man down, not just in miles but in silence. Then, through the veil of rain, he saw it. A faint glow in the distance, no more than a warm flicker. Could be a porch light, could be something else. Either way, it was the only sign of life for miles. He started walking. It was a good 10 minutes of trudging through mud and puddles before the outline of a house came into view. Weather-beaten siding, shutters hanging loose, and a rusted wind vane turning slowly in the wind. But the porch light was real, dim, amber, stubbornly alive. He climbed the creaking wooden steps and hesitated. The last time he'd knocked on a stranger's door like this was during his first tour in '69, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Vietnam. Back then, it was fear in his gut. Now it was weariness. He knocked. The sound echoed strangely in the rain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, just a crack at first. A pair of blue eyes peeked through, then widened. The door swung fully open. "Tommy!" Thomas blinked. The voice raspy, but unmistakable. He knew it in his bones. Vince. Standing in the doorway was a man he hadn't seen in over 30 years. Vincent Calhoun. Back in the day, they'd served together, then lost touch like so many did after the war. Vince had been the quiet one. Smart. Grounded. A hell of a cook, too. Vince looked older, of course. His long gray hair was tucked behind his ears, and a flannel shirt hung loosely on his lean frame. A few days of stubble framed his face, but the eyes, those hadn't changed. Still sharp, still clear. "What the hell?" Vince stepped out into the rain without a word and wrapped Thomas in a tight hug. For a second, Thomas didn't move. Then he slapped Vince's back, laughing through his disbelief. "You're the last person I expected to find out here," Thomas said, pulling back. "I thought this place was abandoned." "It was for a while," Vince replied. "But, well, come inside. You're soaked." The house smelled of wood smoke and old dust, but it was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. A small pile of books stacked nearby. Furniture was sparse, nothing matched, but it was clean. Lived in, if not well kept. Vince handed Thomas a towel and poured coffee from a kettle that had clearly been reheated more times than brewed fresh. Still, Thomas took the mug with both hands like it was gold. "What happened?" Vince asked, settling into the worn recliner across from him. "Transmission's gone. Truck just gave up on me. Couldn't get a signal. Saw your light." "Lucky for you," Vince said, smiling. "You're the first knock I've had in months." Thomas chuckled. "Didn't even know you were alive. Sometimes I wonder that myself." They both laughed, the sound echoing gently through the quiet house. Outside, the storm softened to a drizzle, the occasional growl of thunder rolling low across the hills. After a while, Thomas nodded toward the window. "Think I can tow her here? Safer than leaving her on the shoulder overnight." "I got a beat-up pickup with a tow chain," Vince replied. "Let's go grab it. Ain't much, but it'll do." Minutes later, the two were back out in the rain, the pickup coughing to life under Vince's firm hand. Together, like it was 1985 again, they wrestled the semi into a patch of gravel beside the barn. Mud clung to their boots, and both men were drenched again by the time they finished. But they were smiling. Back inside, Vince tossed Thomas a dry flannel shirt and stoked the fire. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that only old friends can share. No pressure to speak, just warmth and memory and the soft hiss of logs burning. "You ever think about the old days?" Thomas asked finally. "All the time," Vince said quietly. Neither of them said what those days held. The war, the friends lost, the paths that pulled them in different directions. Some wounds didn't need to be reopened. But in that room there was something healing. Outside, the storm was already subsiding. Inside, two men sat by a fire, reunited by chance, their shared history bridging the years. And in the silence that followed, a new story began. The wind had quieted, leaving only the faint hiss of drizzle tapping softly against the windows. Inside the old farmhouse, the fire had burned low, casting a warm, amber glow that danced across the worn floorboards. The silence wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful, like the house itself was holding its breath. Thomas sat on the edge of a battered couch, a new cup of coffee in hand. Vince had gone quiet again, seated in his recliner, the shadows tracing deep lines into his face. Both men stared into the flickering hearth, as if it held answers to questions they didn't dare ask outright. "Can't sleep," Thomas muttered. "Neither can I," Vince replied without turning. The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Just past 2 a.m. Thomas shifted, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His eyes wandered around the room. Framed photographs turned face down, an untouched chessboard, dusty books stacked beside the window. Signs of life, yet all frozen, like time had stopped when no one was looking. "I used to like the road at night," Thomas said after a pause. "Fewer idiots out there. Just me and the hum of the tires. Used to clear my head." "Still drive all the time?" Vince asked, his voice low. Thomas nodded. "Yeah, still hauling coast to coast. Been 30 years. Never did much else." A silence settled again. "Missed a lot because of it," he added, almost to himself. "My son. He was little when I started. I thought it was temporary, just until we saved up, paid off the mortgage. But the months turned into years, and the years into silence. Missed birthdays, missed school plays. Missed him growing up." Vince looked over. His gaze wasn't judgmental, just steady, listening. "He doesn't talk to me much these days," Thomas continued. "Can't blame him. I wasn't there." His mother tried to hold things together, but she got tired of being a trucker's widow with a husband still breathing. Vince gave a slow nod. "The road takes more than it gives." Thomas chuckled bitterly. "Ain't that the truth?" They fell into quiet again, not uncomfortable, just still. Outside, the rain had all but stopped. Only the occasional drip from the roof broke the quiet rhythm of the early morning. "What about you?" Thomas asked, tilting his head toward Vince. "What brought you back here?" Vince didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the hearth, watching a log collapse inward, sending up a final burst of flame. "I used to think I'd never come back to this place," he said softly. "Swore I'd sell it, leave the past behind. But you didn't." "No," he leaned back. "After the accident, there wasn't much left to run toward." Thomas sat up straighter. "Accident?" Vince didn't meet his eyes. He rubbed his hands together slowly, as if trying to warm something far colder than skin. "My wife and my daughter. Car crash. 10 years ago." A beat passed before Thomas spoke. "I'm sorry, Vince." Vince nodded once, eyes still fixed on the fading fire. "They were driving back from a weekend trip. I was working late. Got caught in a storm. Ironic, huh? Some jackass blew through an intersection. Hit them broadside." He fell quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had lost its edge. "It took me years just to step back inside this house. I kept thinking I'd hear her laugh in the kitchen, or see our girl come running down the stairs. But it's just echoes now." Thomas didn't interrupt. He simply sat with him in the silence, knowing there were no words big enough to fill the kind of hole Vince carried. I tried living in the city after that, Vince added. Tried counseling, tried staying busy, but everything felt wrong. I came back here because it was the only place that didn't lie to me. Thomas nodded slowly. You didn't retreat. You survived. However you could. Vince looked at him then. His eyes were wet but clear. Sometimes I wonder if surviving is the right word. They both stared into the fire again. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the window, both men had grown quiet. Not because they ran out of things to say, but because something deeper had passed between them, an unspoken understanding. They had walked through different kinds of storms, but pain, in its many forms, had etched similar lines on both their lives. The fire crackled softly one last time, then settled into glowing embers. Thomas stood and stretched. I should get a few hours of sleep. Truck needs looking at. Vince nodded. You take the couch. I'll put on another pot. As Thomas pulled an old quilt over himself, he looked once more toward his old friend. You ever think about starting over? He asked. Vince thought for a long moment. Then he said, not until tonight. The light creeping in through the curtains was soft and golden, the kind that comes after a storm, the kind that feels like a promise. Dust floated gently in the beams that pierced the old farmhouse's windows, settling over the worn floor like snow. Thomas stirred on the couch, the coarse quilt tangled around his legs. His back ached, and the armrest had pressed an awkward ridge into his ribs. But there was something comforting about waking up to the scent of old wood, damp earth, and percolating coffee. The house groaned softly in the morning breeze. He sat up, rubbing his eyes and blinking at the cluttered but lived-in room. Vince wasn't in sight. The mug he'd used last night sat rinsed on the counter. Outside, a soft clink of metal against metal echoed faintly. Thomas stood, rolled his shoulders with a grunt, and stepped into his boots. Outside, Vince was crouched near the porch steps, fiddling with the broken hinge of a rusted gate. He looked up when Thomas approached, shielding his eyes from the rising sun. Morning, Vince said. His voice had the rasp of someone who hadn't used it yet today. Morning, Thomas replied. Coffee smells like it could bring a man back from the dead. Vince smirked. I make it strong. Helps when the mornings feel older than you do. Thomas chuckled, then looked out across the property. The storm had washed everything clean. The fields, though wild and overgrown, glistened under a film of dew. A few crumbling fence posts leaned like old men trying to hold their balance. A collapsed chicken coop lay in the distance, half swallowed by weeds. Been a long time since I woke up somewhere that didn't smell like diesel and burned rubber, Thomas said, hands on hips. Vince followed his gaze across the landscape, his expression unreadable. You still farming anything out here? Thomas asked. Vince shook his head. Nah. Used to plant corn out near the east field. Had a couple goats, chickens too. Sold it all off or buried what died. Thomas squinted at the fields. So much land just sitting. It's not dead, just forgotten. There was a pause. Vince turned back to the gate, pretending to tighten a bolt that didn't need it. Takes more than I've got to bring it back to life. Thomas didn't respond right away. He took a slow step toward the field, then another, drawn not just by curiosity, but something deeper, familiar. Memories stirred in his bones. Summers spent sweating in the sun. His father's voice calling out over fields. Hands black with soil, back then not yet marked by war or regret. Fences are still salvageable, he said. Barns leaning, but I've seen worse. You got tools? In the shed, Vince said slowly. Mind if I poke around? Vince hesitated, then shrugged. Be my guest. By late morning, the sun was high and the men were knee-deep in dirt and sweat. Thomas had found a coil of barbed wire, half a box of old nails, and a pair of stubborn gloves in the back of the shed. He worked with a kind of quiet joy, sleeves rolled up, mud caking his boots, arms steady as he hammered loose posts back into shape. Vince mostly watched at first, leaning on a rake, unsure whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. But after a while, he found himself moving, clearing debris from the path, stacking old lumber. The rhythm came back to him slowly, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. "You always this eager to do free labor?" Vince asked with a smirk as Thomas hoisted a broken board over his shoulder. Thomas grinned, sweat trickling down his temple. "Beats sitting around feeling sorry for myself." They cleared out the main barn by noon. Dust rose like fog with every step. Old harnesses, bent nails, a rusted wheelbarrow, all dragged into the sunlight. Inside, shafts of light beamed down through holes in the roof, making the dust look like gold. "Place has good bones," Thomas said, leaning against the doorway, breath heavy. "If I were 20 years younger, I'd give it some sweat and care, and these fields could be humming again." Vince laughed, short, surprised. "You? Running a farm? I grew up working one. Before the Marines." He paused. "Before everything." Vince looked at him, then back at the barn. "Never knew that. Lot you don't know about me. Guess we all carry more than we let on." The afternoon passed like a dream they hadn't planned to have. They found a wheelbarrow that still turned, pulled weeds from the front porch, even uncovered an old metal sign buried in ivy that once read, "Harris Farm, St. 1962. When the sun began to dip low and the sky turned that deep orange that only happens in open country, the two men sat on overturned crates beside the barn. A jug of water passed between them. Their hands were dirty, their backs sore, but both wore quiet smiles. "You know," Thomas said after a long sip, "the truck can wait. I just felt this place. And you could use a spark." Vince didn't respond immediately. His gaze wandered out across the land, now soft and glowing under the setting sun. Something was shifting in him, something old and familiar, long buried beneath the weight of sorrow and time. "I know," he said at last. "That's what makes it matter." Thomas looked over, brow raised. "You didn't ask questions. Didn't ask for money. You didn't come here trying to fix me, Tom. Just offered your hands." They sat in silence again, watching the first stars peek through the indigo sky. Vince stood slowly, his body stiff. He looked down at his hands, then back at the house. "I'll make dinner," he said. "Least I can do." That night, as they sat in the kitchen with mismatched plates and reheated stew, the silence between them had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was full. Like the soil they'd turned together, it held the potential for something new. And somewhere in Vince's chest, where grief had once rooted itself like a weed, a new thought was beginning to grow. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood settling under the cool night air. Outside, the wind had calmed to a whisper, rustling through the tall grass like an old lullaby. The day's labor had worn both men down, but not in a bad way. Their muscles ached, their hands bore new calluses, and their shirts still held the scent of sun and dust. But there was something peaceful in the weariness. They sat at the old kitchen table, scarred oak, lit by a single hanging bulb. 2 bowls of hot stew rested between them, steam curling upward into the amber glow. Vince had added potatoes, onions, a few herbs he found hanging dry in the pantry. It wasn't much, but it was warm and tasted like care. Neither spoke much at first, just quiet chewing, the scrape of spoons, and the occasional soft sigh of comfort. Thomas glanced around the room, the faded wallpaper, the crooked frame above the stove, the shelf with 3 dusty cookbooks. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "this stew ain't half bad." Vince let out a breath that was half laugh, half relief. "I cook like a man who hasn't had company in 10 years. Thomas took another bite. "Then I've been eating in the wrong company." A smile passed between them, brief but sincere. Outside, crickets had begun their nightly chorus, and the horizon beyond the window still glowed faintly with the last remnants of twilight. Vince pushed his bowl aside and leaned back in his chair, fingers laced over his stomach. He looked tired, but not the kind of tired that came from work. The kind that lived behind the eyes. The kind that came from carrying something alone for too long. "You remember back in '84, Vince began, voice low, When we ran out of gas just west of Tucson? Thomas chuckled. You mean when you insisted we could make it another 10 miles, and we ended up pushing that old pickup in 105-degree heat? Vince smiled faintly. I kept thinking someone would stop and help. No one did, Thomas said. No, Vince agreed. But we kept pushing. There was a long pause. Vince reached for a half-full glass of water, took a sip, then set it down with care. His eyes didn't lift from the table. I never told you what happened after we lost touch, he said. Thomas didn't speak. He simply sat straighter, listening. I inherited the estate from my uncle around 92, Vince continued. He had oil stocks, land, bonds. He was smart with money. I got lucky. I kept investing, played it safe, let the money grow. Thomas blinked. He hadn't expected that. Vince had never cared for wealth back in the day. And the farm. I bought it as a place for us, Vince said quietly. For my wife, my little girl. I was going to step back from the noise, teach my daughter how to plant tomatoes, how to swing a hammer. He paused, swallowing hard. But 3 years later, they were gone. The silence that followed was heavy, unmoving. Thomas felt the words strike deep, as if they'd landed in his own chest. I came here alone after the funeral, Vince said. Tried to keep it up, tried to do something with the land. But everything I touched felt hollow, so I stopped trying. Let the weeds grow, let the walls crack. I didn't care. Thomas lowered his gaze. Vince, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I never told anyone, Vince said. And I was fine not telling. Until now. He looked up then, and there was something different in his eyes. A spark, small but real. You showing up like that, out of nowhere, busted engine and all. It felt like life knocking again. Like maybe it wasn't too late to try. Thomas nodded slowly. Words caught somewhere in his throat. Vince stood, walked to the window, arms crossed. He stared out at the land bathed in moonlight. The barn, the fields, the gravel driveway that now held a tired but intact 18-wheeler. You ever get tired of the road? Vince asked, still looking out. Thomas tilted his head. Every damn day. I thought about something today, Vince continued. Watching you work. Laugh. Take your time like none of this was beneath you. He turned to face his old friend. What if we turned this place into something more? He said. A place for truckers to stop. Real food. A warm bed. Tools if they need coffee. Maybe someone to talk to when the road gets too long. Thomas stared at him. The idea landed slowly, like snow on a roof. First, light, then suddenly, weighty. You mean like a trucker's rest stop? Not just that, Vince said, coming closer. A haven, place with soul. A place where they're not just passing through, they're welcomed. You could help me run it. You know the road. You know what men like us carry. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. He ran a hand down his face, and for a long moment he didn't speak. But in his chest, something swelled, hope, disbelief, maybe even the start of something like purpose. I don't know, Vince, he said finally. I've spent years running. Don't even know if I remember how to stay in one place. Vince smiled softly. Then maybe it's time you remember. The two stood in the quiet kitchen, the weight of the past hanging between them, but also something else. Possibility, renewal, a different kind of road, waiting to be paved not with asphalt, but with intention. Thomas let out a slow breath, then a smile. Well, he said, if I'm gonna be stuck somewhere, could be worse than a place with stew and broken fences. Vince laughed. That's the spirit. They clinked their water glasses together with the ease of old friends who'd seen too much and somehow found their way back. Not just to each other, but to the idea of beginning again. This story reminds us that sometimes the road leads us exactly where we need to be, even if it's broken. What would you do if a friend reached out to you from the shadows of grief? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that stir the soul. See you in the next video.